Long before I met Chris, I knew his work. In roaming through museums and their contemporary collections, we'd often be beguiled by the work of a ceramicist whose objects were so sensuous one had to touch, especially if a guard was not watching. Perhaps that's why his work in the Jacobs Gallery has a bonnet over it. On a visit to Lisbon and their very important tile museum, we wandered to the more contemporary collection, and leading the parade there was a beautiful Chris Guston piece. We went to the opening exhibit of the Museum of Art and Design. The major collection of important ceramics was headed by you-know-who. It was such a pleasure to find that Chris was almost a neighbor and to make some of his work our very own. So it's a very personal pleasure to introduce a friend and the man of the hour, Chris Guston.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to use this mic instead of this mic. It is really a pleasure to be here and to be part of this museum's collections. Being a local artist, it's interesting. You know, I show work all over the world, and for some reason, artists in their locale tend to be kind of left alone. And so when a museum steps up and says, we value your work and we want it to be part of our collection and our history, it's really quite a huge thing. And it's really an honor, and it doubles so to be part of Fran's legacy in the museum. So I want to thank everybody who participated in that, and I do hope that it continues, that the museum builds a collection of contemporary work that has value to the community and value to the museum. So what I'm going to do tonight is, it's kind of interesting when you, this, by the way, is simply to make sure that the aspect ratio is correct. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I titled this lecture Finding Form. And what I mean by that is that artists are often asked, what is your work about? Okay. And it's an incredibly complex question. You can give the one-liner, you can give a 5-minute conversation, and none of it really means much. It's kind of cliff notes to something. So I want to talk about my career and kind of how my work developed over a period of 40 years. And the reason I want to do that is because anytime you see someone's work, you're seeing it in a moment. You're making an acknowledgement of the work, you're taking it in, you're looking at it, but you're seeing it in a point in time, and you may not understand what came before it, and if a bunch of work has happened since then, there's been transition, and I think the dialogue of why things happen is important. There are teaching moments in that. So I'm going to kind of go over my career. So where I'm starting here is Santa Monica, California. Okay, and I grew up in LA in the 50s and 60s. I left in the early 70s to move to the Midwest and come east. I grew up in a family that my father ran a design company. It was a giftware company where they sold objects, and objects were kind of revered in my family. And my dad was a collector. He collected paperweights. He started in World War II when he was in Normandy and going through Patton's army, and started picking up these Baccarat weights that he purchased for a carton of cigarettes. And over a period of years in his lifetime, he built a huge collection. So I grew up in a house that was full of objects. And so objects resonated. They had meaning to my parents, and it was kind of up to me to figure out why. Okay. This is not me, but is of the vintage era of when I was in LA, and I spent a lot of time at the beach. And the reason I'm kind of have this in here is my wife and I were just in Hawaii I was doing lectures over there, and I kept dragging her over to the beach to look at the waves, and out of conversations with her since then, the ocean is really important to me, and for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons has to do with how waves generate energy through space. And it's a felt experience. And that felt experience is something that resonates in my work. And it was just in this trip a few weeks ago where I actually kind of made the connection that it started way back in like 1965, trying to figure out when a wave is approaching the shore and how to catch it. So how do you catch energy? Okay, that's what my work is kind of trying to deal with. How do you catch energy? Now this is an object from my dad's company, and he had a couple of factories in LA, and I worked in them when I was a kid. And I spent my teen years working in the factories, and then from the factories I went to college, and I dropped out of college, and I ran one of the factories for 2 years. And I was tracking down the road of managing a 300-person ceramic factory in West Los Angeles. This is one of the cookie jars they made. Andy Warhol has one of these in his collection. And, but this was the world I was in. And I finally figured out that I kind of didn't want to go there. You know, I didn't want that part of it. And to show you kind of the power of ceramics, okay, this is Watts Towers, and one of my dad's factories was about half a mile from this tower, and a lot of the pieces from the factory are in the tower. Simon Rodia would come by and go through the shard piles and pull pieces, and when he built the towers, he put them in it. So, transformation. An object that starts out as a casserole ends up as a tower. This is the potential of what ceramics has. Now, this little guy is drinking a little latte, and he doesn't really care what he's drinking it out of. Okay? This is pure utility. This is simply something that is acting as a conduit for a function. But what it is doesn't matter. You know, all it has to do is serve its purpose. This is utility. Okay, we all have experienced this. So you take a styrofoam cup, which is a throwaway. No one ever thinks of it. It's simply get a cup of hot coffee, and you know, you need something light, disposable, take it with you, throw it away. But that's also a styrofoam cup. And as you begin to see, something starts to happen. There's a transformation happening with the styrofoam cup. It now goes past utility into function and aesthetic. And then you take that one step farther, and you have Tara Donovan. These are styrofoam cups, all put together, organized in space. And now you have pure form and sculpture. So the same object seen 3 different ways. This is transformation of object. This is the power of what objects can do. You can start with utility, but you can go just miles from it. This is 2 women having tea, and what's happening between them, the tea and drinking the tea becomes the conduit for something much larger than the drink. Okay, so again, transformation. And then you have this Japanese print of a tea ceremony in 18th century, 18th, 19th century. Okay, so the tea as service, the drinking of tea now becomes performance, becomes social ritual, and an aesthetic experience. So the object that you start with, which is just a container, now has all this potential to do something larger, which is bring people together, participate in ritual, and that is what ceramics is about. So I put together my work over a period of years, and I've organized them into kind of sections of decades. And I didn't really figure this out until a few years ago, but there really are about, I deal with kind of certain ideas over a period of decades. You know, so 10 years I deal with this, and I switch and I do this. So the first decade is kind of trying to figure out what pots are. You know, the apprenticeship of being a potter, how to make a pot, what is utility, what is function. This is my teacher, Ken Ferguson, at Kansas City Art Institute, and he was a mentor, and his mentoring to me had to do with history. He was always taking us to the museums, always taking us to the libraries. He said, look at pots, look at history. That's where the answers are. Don't look at what's happening around you, look back in time. Now, this is a piece made in the 70s, early 70s, and the reason this is here is because of that. Okay, now that is a little squiggle on a pot, a throwaway pot that a 21-year-old makes. Okay, but that squiggle is the history of my work, and it was there at the very beginning. Okay, so this line, this idea of kind of a line that moves through space, generates energy, is kind of how I deal with form. And it was there at the very beginning. This is Kraliki Salmenharju. She was the head designer of the Arabia factory in Helsinki. And she taught at Alfred University when I was there in graduate school in the mid-70s. And she pretended she didn't speak English because she didn't want to deal with the art speak of the moment. So she'd go through the studios just babbling, and everybody would leave her alone. But when she came in to do a crit, instead of talking to you about your work, you'd lay out, let's say, a table full of pictures, and then she'd get in front of them and she'd pull one aside, and then she'd start to dance. And she'd use her body to pantomime what was happening in the object. So she started to connect how the physical person connects to an object, how form of a ceramic piece can connect to the form of the human body, and how emotion and spirit and all of that can be language to be used in pottery form. So this is just some pieces from the mid-70s of just kind of the apprenticeship of pots, learning how to make covered jars, pitchers, pouring pots, you know, platters, cups, jars, all of that type of thing. Learn the language of the material. Now, in the early 80s, there was a show at the Guggenheim on Giorgio Morandi, and I went down to see this, and I was floored. And it was this pretty big exhibition, and Morandi is an amazing artist, but what was incredible to me about his work was the space he deals with between objects, how he deals with what's not solid, okay, and how he gave importance to that. And I was just so blown away by it, because this is what really ceramic form is about. It's about the energy around an object and how you define that through the object. So in this little ink drawing like this, you know, that space between those two kind of pouring pot forms is just so potent, and so alive. So I started to build these forms that had to do with trying to highlight negative space. Okay, and they're still dealing with kind of functional issues. They're still usable, though probably no one would use them, but you could, you know, if you were desperate. You know, and so as I'm looking at these pots, I'm thinking of that line of silhouette. And that line of silhouette has to do with almost like a sense of calligraphic line. Okay, so this is a penmanship cursive book from 1886. Okay, so now if you're in class in 1886 and you're reading this book and you're practicing your cursive, you're doing two things, or probably more than two things. One, you're learning how to write in a cursive language, it's a script. But two, you're entering a social strata by that writing that allows you entrance into a world that if you didn't have that, you had no entrance. So the cursive was acting on two levels, acting one as kind of skill, but two on social structure. Okay, so line is acting as an entrance into a social situation that you might not have access to if you didn't have that ability. Okay, so it's 2-3 different levels there. This is a Persian script. It's a beautiful, beautiful document about that big, and it says, God the Almighty loves beauty, God is beautiful. Okay, now here's an image of this beautiful Arabic, and it's written in such a way, and it's laid out on the paper in such a way that is absolutely exquisite. So you have the language, which speaks of beauty, being put together with the image of that language on paper, on parchment. Okay, and I find that incredibly intriguing, how those two worlds are colliding and working together. And then you have tattoos. Okay, and the tattoo culture has just blown open over the last few years. And, why would somebody mark their body? What are they trying to say? So you have the language or the image on a form, which is your body. And in this case, it's script. But it's also, you're trying to say something. So on the right, you have this religious, kind of saying about how this person is going to behave towards God every day. And it's on his body, so he sees it every day, okay? And the world sees it every day. And so he's kind of held to the gun, okay? This is like potent. This is big stuff. This is not frivolous. It's for his whole life, okay? And so that is intriguing to me. The idea of using language, using script, how the script is written on the body to give meaning. And then you have Keith Haring. Keith Haring, this is 1986, New York, absolutely wild time in the city. Okay, and look at these lines and look at the energy in that painting, and it all says it. It says it all about what was going on, down in Hell's Kitchen at that period of time. So the sense of calligraphy is something I've always looked at. Okay, and I'm making these pots, and I'm trying to figure out how can I use this. So I'm using it as silhouette, how line moves in space, but now I start to make marks inside of a form. So starting to draw on the inside. On the left is it's a root ball from a palm tree, and taking that as an image and how you might deal with the base of a form. But this is the first pots, is like 1981, 82, where just marking the interior starts to happen. And then drawings start to highlight, how I might push that. And then little jars start to get bumped around. And symmetry starts to get questioned. So the thrown form starts to get asymmetrical. Now this is a Persian plate, and the rim of it it's all calligraphic text, and it's a poem. So here again is calligraphy working on a number of levels. It's working as decoration, but it's also working as meaning. Now in the Four Corners region of the U.S. is an area from the 9th century, from 900 AD to about 1200, the Mimbres Indian tribes produced a body of work that was just unbelievable. And then the Mimbres died out, they migrated, no one really knows what happened. And you've probably all seen these pots. The Peabody has an incredible collection of them. And I love these forms, absolutely love them. And they're simple pots, but they're decorated with all these types of geometric and image-related forms, or drawings. And I found this document in a book, and what it is it takes the entire Mimbres culture and breaks it down to 16 different strategies on how form is decorated. Okay, so I see this, and I'm going, oh my God, there's a whole culture that you can kind of annotate in terms of how the circle is divided in space. This is incredible. How could they do this? And so what I did is I Xeroxed this, put it on the wall in my studio, and I'd throw a dart. And wherever the dart landed, I'd then do platters based on the strategy of that image. Okay? So these are glazing platters and doing the drawings. So these are like 1981, 82, somewhere in there. And then the platters themselves. So these are about 26 inches in diameter. So again, trying to play with calligraphy, the hand gesture of movement to create kind of energy. And that's my studio in Guilford, Connecticut at the time after a group of firings. Okay, so it gives you a sense of kind of the amount, the craziness of the work and how it was all kind of in that space. Now, in the early 80s, I had a chance to go to Egypt. My mother was part Greek. She grew up in Cairo and came to the United States during World War II. And we went back in '83 to meet the family. Okay, so her entire family lived in Cairo. We go back to meet them, and we do the obligatory trip down the Nile, which is really, if you haven't done it, try it. It's an amazing experience. And you're stopping at all these amazing sites. And I'm looking at these temples, and I'm looking at these columns, and I'm seeing the Mimbres pots three-dimensional. Instead of image, they're form as capitals. And I look at this capital, and it goes from a cylinder, and it starts to segment, and it starts to break apart and fragment into halves and quarters, and then it goes up to the very top where it's holding the lintel, and it's up to eighths. And then I look at this work, and this is a guy named Bill Daly from Philadelphia, and he's dealing with the same thing, taking the cylinder and starting to fragment it according through geometric structure. So this is all language I'm starting to absorb and feed upon. The figure on the left is a huge column, probably 40 feet tall, and what I'm seeing there is light, how light affects form. And the Mediterranean light's unbelievable, how much contrast there is in it. So how soft and sensuous can a piece of granite be? You know, limestone. On the right is an amazing piece to me. It's a head, and you're seeing the side of the head right there. But what it really is a cube. And the hair is moving from one plane to another. It's an amazingly simple little device to get your eye to go around that corner. Okay, so this is like fabulous information. It's like, oh my God. You know, you take a cube and all of a sudden you can round it. And the Islamic architecture is just fantastic in this in terms of how it takes geometric form and morphs it from like one form into another, and you almost can't see it happening. This is a small figure carved into a column, and I love this one because it shows the kind of the humanity of grace. Okay, so that, you know, this is a slave who's carving, and in that belly button area, everything else is kind of stylized. And you get in that belly button area, and there's a little grace in there. This is like subversive. Okay, and I think that's just amazing. And then around the temples and everything that's being rebuilt were kind of the graveyards of stone that they couldn't figure out where to put it. You know, they go, well, this block goes here, we'll put it here. This block goes there. Well, we don't know where these go, so we'll pile them up. And they had hundreds of these things. And I'm going around going crazy photographing this. This is like a geometric, you know, just wonderland. And I'm looking at all this stuff, and I'm seeing pots. So I come home, and I start to make these. And so these are cylinders that are they're the forms that I did before, but now instead of punching out from the outside, I'm creasing on punching out from the inside, I'm creasing on the outside. And so I'm starting to learn a different language in terms of how to manipulate form. So these are vases from '84, about 28 inches tall, and then doodle drawings of just trying to figure out the language. You know, this is so intriguing when you try to see something new, you got to figure out the language. And then a tea bowl from that period. Again, looking back at history, there's an Oribe Japanese 18th century water pot on the left, and then one of mine on the right. Korean Yi Dynasty ewer, and then my ewers. Okay, I kind of bulked them up a bit. Teapot drawings and doodles from a sketchbook, and then the teapots from that series of doodles. So the language is starting to get what started to be kind of stiff, trying to figure it out, started to get more lyrical and more kind of playful, more sensuous in its sensibility. And then these are the finished pots from those. And if you look at the forms and go back to that very first pot in the early 70s with the doodle drawing on it, you'll see it all throughout here. Now the piece on the left is an interesting one for me because it's using a design device. Okay, and one of the reasons you look at history is you try to figure out what they're doing. You know, it's not just, oh, that's a great piece. It's just, why is it a great piece? And what's happening in that piece is there's a stem that is going from the top to the bottom, and then it wraps around again. And off that stem comes all these little peonies and these little flower forms. Okay, but the stem is what's taking your eye up and around and looping you through the form. So that's like classic 2D, 3D design. So how can you use that? So I'm starting to use it in how I'm creating the folds. Take a fold from the spout, take the line, bring it back under around the handle, bring it back on the, up around the other side. Now these are some pieces, well this is a fountain in northern Portugal. Okay, and this fountain is, I think there are maybe 50 families in the town. It was a very small town. This was the only water source for the town. And people would just line up in this plaza to take water from this fountain. What I love about this is like just beautiful metaphor. It's like the water source for the town, which is life, is coming from one pipe. And the pipe isn't just coming out of the ground, people fill up. The pipe is coupled with these beautiful figures that are just totally like healthy and full of life. And, you know, see that little fold? You know, these guys are healthy. These are, you know, they're not dying here. And this is metaphor at its best in terms of kind of how objects can create meaning for use, if you will. So I'm looking at this stuff and I'm translating it to teapots, like these bulgy kind of, you know, teapot forms that pour and you know, they're like your thighs, but on a day when you really don't want to look there, you know. And I love this kind of stuff. So I'm looking at all that, and I'm understanding that there's something else going on. And so I'm just going to talk about this real quick, the golden ratio, okay? And you probably all know this, but the golden ratio is you take the square, you bisect it, you add a diagonal, you extend the base, you create a radius on that diagonal, and then where that radius crosses the bottom base, right there, you add another rectangle, okay? So you end up with that, okay? Now that ratio is 1 to 6.18, 1 to 1.618. It's called phi, and it's the basis of the Fibonacci series, okay? And Fibonacci is in everything, okay? This ratio is in everything. This guy knew about it, okay, in terms of the figure, and it's in your body. This is one of the reasons it resonates so deeply, is that we all carry it with us everywhere. On the lower right is a DNA molecule, and the length and width of the molecule is perfect 1 to 1.618 in terms of its mathematical proportion. Your face, your hands, your body parts, everything is in relationship to that. If you take a golden rectangle and divide that smaller rectangle into another golden rectangle, you have that. And if you divide it again, you have that. And once more, you have that. And if you go up in space, that's a golden rectangle, and that's a golden rectangle. Okay? So you're going down, macro and micro, up and down. And if you connect the dots, you get that. Now that's a golden spiral. Okay? You know it as that. Okay? It's all throughout nature. You see it everywhere. This is a Tara figure from northern India, 10th century. Okay? And I've looked at these figures for years. And I was always trying to figure them out. And Nancy and I were in London, I think it was London, and we went to a gallery, and we saw this print, this drawing. And this drawing is a mathematical division of Tara figures. And they all are based on it. And I don't know if you noticed, but everything is coming off of the forehead. Do you see that? Okay, and if you start to look, golden rectangle, square, golden rectangles, they're everywhere. So all the ratios, how the arm comes out in space, where the elbow is, where the knee is, where the toes are, all this is based on geometry. And we don't even see it. This is a Greek chalice. Okay. That's the geometry of a Greek chalice. Okay, Greek ceramics historically are all about this. So I use this. This is what I think about when I make work. So that's the square, divide it, separate it into golden rectangles. So that's a golden rectangle, that's a golden rectangle, that's one and that one, and stack them. So I'm using these strategies in building form. So the forms I work from come from some type of intuitive space, but they're also working off of geometric relationships. This is a square in a circle. So imagine this as, instead of shape, imagine it as form, and you're going to move up in space. So you're going to take that square and rotate it up in space. And as you move up in space, you get that. Okay? This is a basic strategy used in architecture all over the world. Okay? But it also has some other potential. Okay? The Great Mosque in Iraq on the left, okay, which is basically the squares rotating on themselves, moving up in space. But what's amazing on this, it's acting on another level, which is metaphor. So you have the secular world at the base, and as you take the journey up, you get to God. Okay, so it's transitional space, and it's using geometry and using the spiral to do it. And on the right, you have a Madonna figure from Alcobaça, Portugal, and it's doing the same thing through the garment of the figure, of the Madonna figure. Okay, so it starts at the feet, and it moves to the eyes. And so your eyes are just drawn up in the spiral to her gaze. Okay? So these are two examples of two religious cultures that are using the spiral as a form of transition to metaphorical space. Okay, incredible. I just love this stuff. Okay, so how do I use it? Okay, I use it as a way of trying to play with how you move your eye around a form. So these are two large vases from the late 80s, and they're starting to spiral off the base. So if you look down on them, you'd be going down in a spiral. Okay, so this is radical move from kind of the equal access point of a ceramic vessel, where the skin is always equidistant from the center. Okay, if you put a dowel down the center of a pot, the skin of the pot is always the same. It's always the same distance no matter where you are. This starts to change that. So what seems like a small move is actually pretty radical in terms of thinking of form. And as that started to kick in, these are doodle drawings of vases, the large intestine. I did a workshop once, and somebody sent me a whole tube of x-rays of intestines, which I greatly appreciated. And then this gourd form, which is working just right off the large intestine on that one. And then these pots. Okay, so it's all playing this idea of internal form, the body form from inside, not outside. And then these are a series of those vases. The spiral is happening on that one on the right quite a bit. Now, in the early 90s, I started to think of kind of breaking out of the mold a bit, and I was looking at a lot of comic books, and I'd always looked at comic books. And this is Zap Comics, and this is from the late 60s, early 70s. But the idea of the kind of animated form, my work was getting very animated. It was getting, and I was interested in kind of the humor, the potential in that. I was also interested in balance. Okay, Martha Graham, and the beautiful balance of line, and how kind of impossible it seems on one level, you know. And so out of that came a series of teapots, you know. So the idea of the teapot got totally blown away. There's no entrance, you know. Where's the entrance? There's no, you know, there's no lid. There's no, you know, where's, you know, what is the spout? What is the handle? You know, I started to play intellectually with the ideas of this kind of primal form in ceramic history. You know, so I worked basically like 2 or 3 years on these, you know, just dealing with this one form. And then something happened. Nancy and I went to Europe, and I had a sabbatical. I went to Spain for a month. We went to Lisbon, and out of that, I started to kind of see stuff that felt important to think about. And one of it had to do with, my forms are very soft. Everything was soft. And I thought they were kind of starting to get too squishy. They needed something else in it. And so I started to look at buildings. And we were in Barcelona and looking at Gaudí. And when we got off the tram, or you know, and walked across, and just, you know, there's like all these buildings next to this. And, you know, it's like crazy cityscape, everything's crazy, and then you have this sitting amongst it all. It just is like this red herring sticking out, and you go, oh my God. You know, and talk about juxtaposition. And so I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing organic form played against edge. You know, hard line played against soft form. And it was like, that's it. So I started to look at all this stuff. Frank Gehry, this was later, but it's in my language. And this beautiful Islamic architecture where you have these curved walls playing against these hard angles. So out of this comes a series of work. Now this is pre-Columbian Peru mochi vessels. And what the Peruvians did, which was absolutely incredible, they're the only culture in the world that did this. They could take pure sculptural form, and by putting a stirrup handle on it, make it a pot, make it a functional vessel. Okay, so they could make anything, as long as it was hollow, they could put a stirrup on it, and it would become a vessel. And it sounds so simple, yet no one did it. Everybody, all the work that did have stirrup handles on it was all round pot forms with a handle on it. These guys did it different. And I took that as a source because I wanted my work to maintain the context of the vessel. I didn't want it to be pure sculpture. I wanted to hold the idea of the inner space. So I put stirrups on these and then did a whole series of mochi pots. And then took the stirrups off and then made teapots out of them. And then took the spouts and handles off and made vases. So one form led into another. They're all like self-reflective. Now in '95, I was invited to go to the Azores as part of a multimedia symposium. They invited 25 artists from around the world, and we show up on the island of Fayal. And the island was using this symposium as a means of attracting tourism. They did not want big hotels. They did not want all this. What they did is they brought 25 artists in to work for a month, make art, and then we were donating it to this new museum they were building. And the museum would become the kind of the Benny, if you will, the go-to for tourism. And then the rest of the work would go on exhibition all throughout Europe. Big catalog, the whole deal. And I get there, I get off the plane, and I'm in the taxi with my host, and he turns to me and says, oh, by the way, we don't have any clay. And I'm the only ceramic artist in the place. There's musicians and sculptors and painters and performance artists and writers, and you know, and this is like your worst nightmare dream, you know. And they couldn't get clay. And you got to remember, I don't know if you know where the Azores is, but it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not like you can call and get, you know, something delivered. So There was no art supply on the island, nothing. No paper, no art paper. You couldn't go down and get paper to draw on. I mean, you could get note paper. So I started to freak out. So I got to come up with something. There's a lot at stake here. So I'm looking at the island, and I love these hedgerows. It's in the middle of the Atlantic, so if you want to grow a garden, you have to have a hedgerow to grow it in, because the wind is too strong. But what grows in the garden is unbelievable. It's 65 to 75 all year round. If you haven't been, go. And it's a volcanic island, and it's a maritime island. So everything, all the language is either, volcanic or seafaring, in terms of objects. And then I go out to this place, and this is at the end of Fayal. It's a volcano, and it's called Capeleños, and it rose from the sea, I think, in 1956. Okay, and one day it wasn't there, and the next day it erupted in the ocean, about a half-mile out from land, and it connected to the land, and it was a huge explosion, and in it was that big bowl that you see in the end there. And I spent 3 days just sitting in that bowl contemplating my situation. And here's another view of it. And you see the rim and then the bowl inside. This is just an amazing space to be in. It's like being in one of those Mimbres pots, if you will. So I see that and I go, okay, I know what to do. So I go to the quarries, I get stone, get lava, and carve lava. So I make lava pots, working off the language of the volcano. Okay? And when I come home, I transfer it to clay and start building double-walled vessels. So up until this point, everything's single-walled, and out of that experience becomes a double wall. So interior space is not the same as exterior space. So these are about this big right now, at this point. And drawings from that series, just little charcoal drawings. And then a fireplace I did for our house. We built a house and decided to do a fireplace. And so some of the language is in that. Now up until this point, I don't know if you ever think about this. I think about this stuff all the time. But how you relate to an object, you do it through your body. Okay? And pottery is usually dealt with through your hands. And so you pick something up, you wash it, you eat off of it, you put it away, you clean it, all this stuff, you pick it up and move it. There's an authority of body to object. Okay? And it has to do with the scale of the object in relation to your body. But there's another way of thinking about scale to your body. Okay? And that's this. Okay? This is person to person, which is a different sense of scale. So you have this little hand touching the back. It's all about touch. It's all about the emotion of that connection, okay, which is very different than picking up a bowl to eat off of. Now, this is an acatillo bush in southeastern Arizona where Nancy and I have a place. And it's this beautiful bush, and it various times of the year it'll flower. Okay, so I took a photograph of this, loved it. But what you're not really getting is that's the scale of it. Okay, so scale is a relative issue. Okay, scale is not the same as size. Scale has to do with how one thing relates to another. And the way most people deal with scale, how we see scale, is how we see it in relation to our body. Is it big or is it small? We make that determination based on how we fit into the picture. Okay? So I started to make those pots big because I wanted the scale to get more personal. And by personal, I meant one-to-one. Okay? So instead of touching it by picking it up and moving it, I wanted you to touch it like you might touch another person. When you say hello to somebody, you put your hand on their shoulder. When some people do, not everybody. Give them a hug, all of this type of thing. So shifting the work up opened another door to experience that the smaller work was different than. Okay, another huge shift in thinking. So these are some pieces from that series. So these are about 3 feet wide, 4 to 5 feet tall. Okay. All double walled. What's happening on the inside is not the same as the outside. Okay, now at this time, I was dealing with all these forms and shapes, and I'd build these pieces on these big plaster bats, and when I'd move them off the bat, the shape of the foot would be this beautiful shape kind of mirrored onto the bat. I said, God, those are great shapes. I got to do something with that. So I decided to work two-dimensionally or through image and make platters. So here's a series of platters, and then drawings from those platters. So it's taking the language of the large pieces and kind of flattening them, if you will. You know, and again, looking at Minbury pots, looking at nature, how geometry is used in cell structure. You know, so I go back to that. I'm looking at how image is organized on a circle. I'm thinking of that. Okay. That is a worm that's been dissected and dyed. So that's the cell structure of an earthworm. Okay. Pretty amazing. You know, and taking that information and thinking about it in terms of how to use color in image. Looking at nature again, butterfly, dealing with couplets, how two things work together, and then doing big platters on it. So that brings us up to about the early 2000s, and Nancy and I went to, on that trip in '95, we were in Paris, and we were at the Cluny Museum, and I took this shot. And there were more in the display, but these are about 9 feet tall. They're huge, and there are no heads on them. There's no arms. There's nothing to say it's a figure. Okay, at one point they did have all this, but they've been lost in history. There's nothing to say it's a figure except for proportion and line and gesture. Okay, incredibly potent, where you're reading image off of just the information in front of you. It's not literal. At this time I built a wood kiln at my studio, and was firing work for the university. I taught at the University of Massachusetts for a number of years, and built the kiln basically as a teaching tool for the students. I was tired of them just being stuck in the studio. I wanted them to get out to work together instead of working individually. I wanted to know what a team was, what all of that is about, and wood firing is all about that. And at the time, this was '99, I was up teaching at Anderson Ranch in Snowmass Village in Colorado, and I get a call from Nancy, and she tells me, Chris, we don't have really any vases in the house. Do you think you could make some vases while you're up there? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I could make some vases. So I make some vases, and these are some drawings I did after the fact, but these are the vases that came out of that. These are just small they're throwaways. They were, working at 1 in the morning, throwing a dozen pieces and just punching around, playing with them and throwing them in a kiln. Completely not thought of. I mean, they were thought of in the moment I was doing it, but they were not serious work. And they come out of the kiln and they become very serious work really quick. And out of that comes this, out of that comes this, and started to increase in scale and moves into larger scale stuff. And what starts to happen is forms start to soften again. And so this is a bowl. It's 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Okay, porcelain in the wood kiln. There's no glaze on this. It's just raw. It's just from the flame. Another bowl about the same dimension. a little taller. And so forms are starting to soften out to let the flame and the glaze react to the process of the firing. A little bigger, about 3 feet. You know, again, looking at nature for source, so just how erosion works on stone, and kind of how edge is created through, you know, how water moves over a form, and then thinking how glaze moves over a form, how wood ash melts. So creating a little shoulder for something to slide down or to hold up against. Looking at how figures are used throughout history. You know, the Cyclotic on the right and Venus of Willendorf. You know, the gesture, the kind of the potency of the form of the figure, the abstraction of it. Jean Arp, and how light defines form. And these are all things. These aren't literal in terms of, like I look at a photograph, I think of this is stuff I'm constantly kind of aware of, and this is where my eye goes. And so I'm building these big pieces. This is October 2005, and I'm building these big forms, and I get a phone call. And this is my brother David, and David had MS, and he had just died, and it was like this horrific moment in my life. And I share it with you because in that moment, it was like you just totally try to rethink everything that's happened. You know, we've all gone through this. If you haven't, you will. You know, this is what life is. And David had MS, and he was deteriorating over the couple of years before this. And he and I would have conversations, and he would talk to me about how he would have to slow down his life in order to stay healthy. And what that meant was that he couldn't work the way he used to work. He couldn't do the parties and the friends like he used to do. He had to kind of separate out and push things aside and eject. He had to simplify in order to kind of be able to deal with the day. And this sounds like, I don't know, it's a process that comes from need. It's very rare that one does this from choice. And he and I were talking about this quite a bit. We had many conversations about it because it was painful, you know. But in the end, he was completely at peace when he died. And I lose him, and I have this work in my studio, and I have a show in 6 weeks. And I'm like devastated. And I want to cancel the show. And Nancy convinces me that I shouldn't do it. I should go forward. I need to be in my world to help recover. And so I decided that I'd honor him by simplifying. And so what I did is I did the whole show in white glazes, which is the first time I ever put together a body of work that was unified in content and form and surface and color. So it's a very different way of thinking of the work. And so out of it came a series of these big vessels that were all glazed white and just really quiet. And this was a huge move in terms of thinking of how color, surface, form affect emotion. So this was a gift. So subsequent bodies of work, or some of the work is still in that group. This is loading kilns. Just give you a sense of the studio. And then work that came out of that. So glaze and color and surface, how it affects form, is really leads you to meaning and content. And I'm after glazes that are subdued and glazes that punch for different reasons, you know. And as glaze melts and as wood ash melts on the glaze and it runs, it forms these fingers of color. And what that does is it begins to define the form itself. It's almost like thinking of how one might dress. Stripes, vertical or horizontal today? You know, it's that kind of thing. These are about 3.5, 4 feet tall, I guess. That's about 5 feet. You know, the gesture of a shoulder. You know, how you read the meaning of a form, meaning of an interaction with another person. Okay, and so it's this form, this piece, this is how this one's organized. Okay, so that's the basic unit that everything's built off of. You know, so it's taking a group of golden rectangles and sliding them in themselves. Now, I've been told, I've had 2 collectors call me and tell me that their kids love my work because they're really good for hide and seek. And this is one of them. And the other guy in Chicago practically had a heart attack when he walked in and found he had 2 of my pieces and 2 kids were in them, totally hiding, and some kids in the corner going 1, 2, 3. So anyway, so this is a series over the last couple of years. You know, kind of the sense of the pregnant form. You know, that belly. I had 2 instances where women came up to me. One woman came up to me at a show that this piece was in, and she said to me that she really felt. I mean, this is kind of weird, okay? But she really felt that looking at my work made her want to like get pregnant. Not with me, but you know, just wanted. You know, she wanted to experience what the work was doing. And another woman told me after I did a slideshow, she came up to me and she goes, you know, your work makes me want to gain 10 pounds. You know, which is really rare to hear. So this is loading, so you can see kind of how they're fired. And that's the finished firing, and then that's the finished piece. These are fairly new, within the last 6 months. That's at the New Bedford Art Museum. I did a series of drawings this past, I guess it was about 1.5 years ago, these big charcoal drawings. And these were kind of fun because they started to get into another kind of feeling of humor. I mean, there was a different edge to them, and I really liked that. You know, so working off of these, and then pieces coming from those, and you know, sometimes the pieces come first, sometimes the drawings come first. You know. So these are open, so single wall, but you can get inside. It's like the piece outside here. So these are about 4 feet tall. And then this was the exhibition I had at UMass about 1.5 years ago, I guess. You know, and it's rare to put your work in one space like that. You usually have 3 or 4 pieces in a show, but the university did an amazing job, and it was really quite fabulous for me. And this last series is a series of platters I did at the same time, and to talk about again the structure of them. You know, I think it's clear. I love structure, but I love it kind of how it's hidden underneath everything. And these are the platters. Those are like drawings on them, and then wax and latex separating them out, and then glaze with wax on top of it, and then you put it in the kiln. So that's the structure, and that's the fired piece. So it's allowing heat to move the glaze to let go of the viscosity and let it run. But underneath it is the memory of the structure that it was in. So it's this kind of, it's like a dream, kind of. And I'm interested in that duality. And then these last ones were taking more of the vertical forms. These are all wood-fired and dealing more with the kind of the concept of landscape. So now this last, just a few more slides. This is the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, California. Again, this was built in the mid-60s. And all that brown stuff on the side of that building is tile. It's Heath Tile. And the factory that my dad ran, that I cleaned the toilets in when I was a teenager and swept the floors, had one huge section of the factory making this tile. Okay? And so the extra tile from that job ended up on our living room floor, on our dining room floor, and our whole house was tiled in it. So I'm very intimate with this tile. Okay, so this is 1965, 66, somewhere in there, when this was built. Okay, this is the Kappa building at Bennington College. Okay, and Kappa is the Center for Advancement of Political Action. And this was built by Todd Williams and Billy Chen from New York. They're the architects. They're doing the new museum in Philadelphia, the Barnes collection. And anyway, the museum, this building was built from materials that were within 300 miles, and a lot of the materials were materials that were discarded and then reused in this building. So this is all marble and stone that just was the waste cuts of other stuff. And so they recycled it all. And I got the contract to do all the tile work for the interior bathrooms. They put 5 apartments in for visiting lecturers, and I did all the tile in them. So this is one of the apartments. This is another apartment. So each apartment had a different color. This is the third. The fourth. Or maybe there's 6. And that. So in 45 years, I went full circle from Heath tile on the floor of my house to doing this tile. And so both my parents have passed, but I think they would find that rather amusing. So I just want to end this with this is what it starts with, and this is what we all start with. This is not unique to ceramics. This is where we all begin. And I titled this Finding Form. And finding form is about, finding a life, finding meaning in what you do. And it's hard work, and it's all the stuff we all know. And what's really important is that you have a little fun when you do it. Okay? So this is my daughter and I after a big clay fight. Okay. And then I have a studio assistantship program in my studio where interns come from all over the country and work with me for a period of a year or two. I usually have 1 or 2 at a time, and this is a group over the last about 10 years that have been working with me. And they've made all this stuff possible. And then those 2 have made it all possible too. That's Nancy and my daughter Lila. So thank you very much.